The massive doors of the Galactic Council chamber groaned open with a sound like distant thunder. Every head turned as Vextu entered the hall, his heavy footsteps echoing off the crystalline walls. The Catherian warrior stood nearly 8 feet tall, his dark blue carapace bearing the scars of countless battles. 6 glowing amber eyes swept across the assembled delegates, taking in the representatives from 47 different worlds. The chamber itself was a marvel of galactic engineering. Floating platforms accommodated beings of every conceivable shape and size. Aquatic zephyrians floated in sealed water pods, while the gaseous nebula folk flickered like living auroras in their containment fields. At the center of it all sat the High Arbiters, ancient beings whose species had witnessed the rise and fall of countless civilizations. Vextu's chitinous armor clicked as he moved, each step deliberate and measured. His forearms hung at his sides, the lower pair ending in razor-sharp claws that had torn through enemy hulls during the war. A jagged scar ran from his left eye down to his mandibles, a reminder of the plasma grenade that had nearly killed him on Kepler Station. Witness Vextu, spoke High Arbiter Lindar, her voice carrying the weight of millennia. You stand before this council to provide testimony regarding alleged war crimes committed by the human species during the Third Sector conflict. The charges are severe, unnecessary brutality, violation of prisoner rights, and tactical barbarism. The Catherian warrior approached the testimony platform, circular stage that rose from the chamber floor like a silver mushroom. As he stepped onto it, holographic displays flickered to life around him, showing star maps of the contested sectors and casualty reports from dozens of worlds. Honored council members, Vextu began, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through the very structure of the chamber. You have summoned me here expecting tales of human savagery. You want to hear about their plasma rifles tearing through our ranks, their fusion bombs turning our cities to glass, their warships reducing entire fleets to floating debris. The delegates leaned forward, their various sensory organs focused intently on the scarred warrior. This was exactly what they expected, confirmation that humanity was the monster species they believed it to be. But I must disappoint you, Vextu continued, his 6 eyes dimming slightly. The true horror of fighting humans was not their capacity for destruction. It was something far more terrifying, their refusal to abandon their humanity even in the depths of war. A ripple of confusion passed through the chamber. The Valdris delegation, tall gray beings with elongated skulls, exchanged nervous glances. The insectoid hive collective buzzed with agitation, their translator units struggling to process the unexpected direction of the testimony. I commanded the 47th Assault Battalion when we first made planetfall on Tertius Prime, Vextu said, his voice taking on the cadence of a soldier recounting a mission briefing. The planet was a strategic choke point. Whoever controlled it would dominate 3 major shipping lanes. My orders were simple: establish a beachhead, eliminate human resistance, secure the primary spaceport. How the holographic displays shifted, showing a 3-dimensional map of Tertius Prime. The planet hung in the air like a green and blue jewel, surface marked with tactical overlays showing troop movements and battle zones. The initial assault went according to plan, Vextu continued. Our drop pods screamed through the atmosphere. Our plasma artillery silenced their defensive batteries, and our ground forces pushed inland toward the capital. I had fought in 17 campaigns before this one. I knew how wars were supposed to unfold. His mandibles clicked together, a sign of nervousness that few outside his species would recognize. But on the 3rd day, everything changed. My unit was advancing through the Crimson Valley when we walked into a hegemony ambush. Those metallic bastards had been waiting for us, hidden in the canyon walls like mechanical spiders. The chambers, lighting dimmed as the holographic display showed the valley, its red stone walls rising like the ribs of some ancient beast. Small figures representing soldiers moved across the terrain, blue for Catherian forces, red for the robotic hegemony. Plasma fire erupted from every direction, Vextu said, his voice growing tense with remembered fear. My warriors dove for cover behind the scattered boulders, but the hegemony had us in a perfect crossfire. Their energy weapons could punch through Catharian battle armor like it was paper. I watched good soldiers warriors I had served with for years fall one by one, his lower arms clenched into fists. That's when I saw the human patrol. They had been advancing parallel to our position, probably heading for the same objective. Logic dictated they should have retreated or found another route. Any rational military commander would have avoided a fight that wasn't theirs. Paused, his six eyes focusing on something beyond the chamber walls, beyond the present moment. But humans, as I learned that day, are not always rational. The tension in the chamber was palpable now. Even the usually stoic arbiters seemed to lean forward slightly, waiting for the revelation that would change everything they thought they knew about humanity. I saw him first, a human soldier named Taemin, average height for his species, brown hair, wearing the standard-issue combat armor of the Earth Defense Force. Nothing particularly remarkable about him. It's just another human grunt in a galaxy full of warriors. The holographic display zoomed in, showing the valley floor where the ambush was taking place. Energy bolts crisscrossed the space like deadly fireworks, while the small figures representing soldiers scrambled for cover. Taemin broke from his unit's position and sprinted directly into the kill zone. At first, I thought he was trying to flank the hegemony positions. But then I realized something that made my blood run cold. He was running toward us, not away from the enemy. Murmur ran through the assembled delegates. This wasn't standard military procedure for any known species. It was tactical suicide. Plasma. Bolts seared the air around him, Vextu continued, his voice dropping too barely above a whisper. One caught him in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending him crashing into the rocky ground. I could smell his burned flesh from 50 meters away. Any sane being would have stayed down, would have crawled to safety. The scarred warrior's six eyes blazed with an emotion the council couldn't quite identify, but Taemin got back up. Stumbled forward, one arm hanging useless at his side, and reached one of my fallen soldiers, a young warrior named Kethrin, who had taken a direct hit to the chest. The human grabbed my soldier and began dragging him toward cover, moving in short bursts between the scattered boulders. Each movement drew more fire from the hegemony positions. Any rational being would have abandoned the wounded enemy and saved themselves. Vexthu's voice cracked slightly. Instead, Taemin called out in broken Catharian, our language, which he had somehow learned, shouting for medical assistance. That's when I saw her, Bora, the human medic, carrying equipment that was never designed for our physiology. The chamber fell silent, except for the soft hum of life support systems and the gentle bubbling from the Zephyrian water pods. Even the Hive Collective had stopped their constant buzzing. Together, those two humans worked under fire to save not just Kethrin, but to other warriors from my unit. Were improvised treatments using human medical supplies, adapting their techniques for Catharian biology through pure intuition and desperate determination. That human could have left us to die, Vexthu said, his voice growing stronger. Their mission objectives didn't include rescuing enemy casualties. Their own survival should have been their priority. Every military doctrine in the galaxy would have supported their decision to withdraw. Six eyes swept across the chamber, meeting the gaze of delegates from dozens of worlds. But they didn't withdraw. They stayed, they fought, and they saved lives that weren't their responsibility to save. 3 of my best warriors lived that day because 2 humans decided that some things were more important than victory. The High Arbiter Lindar shifted. In her seat, her ancient features creased with confusion. Witness Vexthu, are you testifying that humans showed mercy to enemy combatants? Mercy. Vexthu's mandibles clicked in what might have been laughter. No, honored Arbiter. What I witnessed was far more dangerous than mercy. I witnessed humans being human, even when everything around them demanded they become monsters. Implications of his words settled over the chamber like a heavy blanket. This was not the testimony anyone had expected, least of all the prosecution who had built their case on human brutality. That was when I realized Vexthu concluded, his voice barely audible in the vast chamber. We weren't fighting mere warriors. We were fighting something far more dangerous than any weapon or tactic. We were fighting a species that refused to lose their souls, even in the depths of war. The holographic display above Vextu shifted to show Kepler Station, a massive cylindrical structure rotating slowly against the star-filled void. The station stretched 4 kilometers, its hull bristling with docking ports, communication arrays, and defensive weapons that now lay silent and cold. Kepler Station was supposed to be impregnable, Vextu said, his 6 eyes reflecting the blue glow of the hologram. Built into an asteroid field, protected by automated defense grids, supplied by regular cargo runs from 3 different sectors. It was our forward command post, our eyes and ears in the outer rim territories. The chamber's atmospheric processors hummed softly as delegates from across the galaxy listened with growing unease. The Zephyrians in their water pods pressed closer to the transparent walls, their tentacles writhing with anxiety. The siege began on the 14th cycle of the war, Vextu continued, his voice taking on the rhythm of a military briefing. The hegemony arrived not with a massive fleet, but with something far worse: patience. They positioned their ships at every hyperspace exit point, every supply route, every possible escape vector. Kepler Station became a tomb floating in space. The holographic display zoomed in to show sleek hegemony vessels, their black hulls absorbing light like mechanical shadows. Each ship was a masterpiece of deadly engineering, bristling with plasma cannons and missile tubes. They formed a perfect sphere around the station, maintaining just enough distance to avoid the defensive batteries while ensuring nothing could get in or out. Over 2,000 beings were trapped inside that station, Vextus said, his claws scraping against the metal podium with each word. Humans, Cytherians, Valdris, even a small group of Hive collective drones who had been negotiating trade agreements. Different species, different cultures, different ways of thinking about survival. His mandibles clicked together as he remembered. At first, we maintained discipline. The station commander of Valdris, named Sektar, organized rationing schedules and defensive rotations. We had enough supplies for 30 days if we were careful, maybe 40 if we pushed it. The plan was simple: hold out until the relief fleet arrived. The scarred warrior paused, his 6 eyes dimming slightly. But the relief fleet never came. Day after day, we watched the long-range sensors, hoping to see friendly ships dropping out of hyperspace. Instead, we saw more hegemony vessels joining the blockade. By the 20th day, they had nearly 50 ships surrounding us. The tension in the chamber was building like pressure in a sealed container. Even the usually emotionless Hive collective representatives were leaning forward, their compound eyes glittering with interest. By then, our food supplies were nearly gone, Vextu continued. The recycling systems were breaking down faster than we could repair them. The air itself was starting to taste stale and metallic. That's when the real nature of different species began to show. He gestured with one of his upper arms, and the holographic display shifted to show the interior of the station: cramped corridors, overcrowded living spaces, and storage bays that grew emptier by the day. The Valdris began hoarding their rations, using their natural cunning to hide extra food supplies. The Hive collective drones simply shut down non-essential functions and entered hibernation mode to conserve resources. Even my own people, the Cytherians, started preparing for the inevitable. We began choosing who would get the last of the medical supplies, who would receive the final food rations. His voice grew quieter, more introspective. We were all preparing to die with dignity in our own ways. It's what civilized species do when faced with impossible odds. We accept the reality of the situation and try to minimize suffering. The chamber fell silent except for the soft bubbling of the Zephyrian pods and the distant hum of the station's massive life support systems. But the humans, Vexu said, his voice suddenly stronger. The humans did something unthinkable. Holographic display focused on a section of the station's engineering deck, where a group of figures in human uniforms were gathered around what looked like a dismantled atmospheric shuttle. A human engineer named Heian Wu called a meeting in Cargo Base 7. I attended because, as senior Cytherian officer, I felt obligated to hear whatever desperate plan they had concocted. What I heard defied every principle of military strategy I had ever learned. Vexthu's 6 eyes blazed with remembered amazement. Hyenwu stood before a group of volunteers, humans mostly, but a few others who had apparently lost their minds, and announced they were going to attempt supply runs. Through the hegemony blockade, a ripple of disbelief passed through the assembled delegates. The insectoid representatives chittered among themselves, their translator units working overtime to process the implications. The Valdris commander Sectar called it suicide. Vexthu continued. Even I, who had seen humans do impossible things, thought they had finally snapped under the pressure. 50 hegemony warships, each one capable of vaporizing a shuttle with a single plasma burst, and they wanted to fly cargo runs like it was a routine delivery mission. The scarred warrior's mandibles spread in what might have been a smile. Hyenwu had already thought it through. He pointed to the atmospheric shuttles, small craft designed for planetary landings, not space combat. These ships are too small for their targeting computers to lock onto easily, he said. If we modify them right, strip out everything non-essential, we might be able to slip through their sensor nets. The holographic display showed the engineering team at work. Human hands moving with practiced efficiency as they tore apart the shuttles and rebuilt them into something entirely new. Armor plating was removed and replaced with sensor-dampening materials. Engines were overcharged and fitted with makeshift cooling systems. Cargo holds were expanded by removing passenger seats and life support equipment. Do-Yoon was the first. To volunteer as a pilot, Vexthu said, his voice filled with something approaching reverence. A human female, barely out of her training cycles, with more courage than sense. She looked at that cobbled-together shuttle, held together with emergency welds and gravity tape, and called it beautiful. The display zoomed in on the modified shuttle. It looked nothing like the sleek craft it had once been. Its hull was a patchwork of different materials, its engines jury-rigged with spare parts from a dozen different systems. It should have fallen apart the moment it left the hangar bay. Their first run was supposed to be a test, Vexthu continued. Slip out through the asteroid field, reach a supply cache hidden on one of the outer rocks, and return with whatever they could carry. Valdris calculated a 3% chance of success. I was more optimistic. I gave them 5%. His claws scraped against the podium as he leaned forward. Do-Yoon launched that shuttle at 0300 station time when the hegemony patrol patterns created a brief gap in their sensor coverage. We watched on the tactical displays as that impossible little ship weaved between asteroids, its jury-rigged stealth system somehow fooling sensors that should have detected it from light years away. The chamber held its collective breath as Vexthu continued his account. 3 hours later, she returned with enough medical supplies to treat 50 wounded, food rations for another week, and spare parts for the water recycling system. But more than that, she brought something we had almost lost hope. The holographic display showed the shuttle limping back to the station, its hull scarred by near misses from hegemony patrol ships. Tiny figures could be seen in the hangar bay cheering as the impossible craft touched down. That was just the first run, Vexthu said, his voice rising with excitement. Over the next 20 days, they made 17 trips through that blockade.
17.
Each time bringing back supplies we desperately needed, each time proving that humans simply refused to accept the impossible. His 6 eyes swept across the chamber, taking in the amazed expressions of delegates from dozens of worlds. Shuttle was hit by plasma fire on the 8th run. The port engine was completely destroyed, the hull breached in 3 places. The navigation system was held together with emergency patches. Any rational pilot would have declared the craft unflyable. The scarred warrior's mandibles clicked with what could only be described as admiration. Instead, she spent 6 hours in the engineering bay with Hyenwu, cannibalizing parts from other shuttles to keep her ship flying. When I asked her why she didn't just take one of the remaining intact shuttles, she patted the patched hull of her battered craft and said, "This one knows the way home." On the 15th run she was carrying medical equipment for our wounded when a squadron of hegemony fighters spotted her. I watched the tactical display as 6 enemy ships converged on her position, fusion missiles streaking through space like angry stars. Vexthu paused, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Do-Yoon didn't panic. She didn't abandon her. cargo to gain speed for escape. Instead, she did something that still gives me nightmares. She flew directly into the densest part of the asteroid field, using the floating rocks as cover while enemy missiles exploded all around her. The holographic display showed the harrowing chase, the tiny shuttle dancing between house-sized asteroids while enemy fighters tried to get a clear shot. Explosions bloomed in space like deadly flowers as missiles struck rock instead of their intended target. She made it back with half her hull melted and her life support systems running on backup power, Vextu concluded. When she climbed out of that shuttle, the first thing she did was ask if we needed her to make another run. The chamber was completely silent now, every delegate transfixed by the tale of impossible courage. The terrifying part, Vextu said, his voice carrying to every corner of the vast chamber, wasn't their recklessness or their refusal to accept reality. It was their absolute, stubborn determination that no one would die on their watch. They turned a hopeless siege into a victory, through nothing more than pure, unbreakable human will. He straightened to his full height, his scarred carapace gleaming under the chamber's lights. That's when I truly understood what we were fighting. Not just another species, not just another military force, but beings who could look at impossible odds and simply decide they didn't care. The holographic display above the chamber transformed into a swirling mass of purple and gold gases, shot through with streaks of electric blue lightning. The shattered nebula hung in space like a cosmic storm frozen in time, its charged particles, creating a deadly maze that could fry any ship's electronics in seconds. The Battle of the Shattered Nebula, Vextu said, his voice growing heavy with the weight of memory. Even now, 3 cycles later, I wake up at night seeing those images burned into my mind. It should have been the end of everything, the final battle that would decide the fate of 3 sectors. The assembled delegates leaned forward as the display zoomed in to show 2 massive fleets facing each other across the nebula's outer edge. On one side, the sleek ships of the Catherian Armada, their hulls gleaming like polished obsidian. On the other, the battered remnants of the human fleet, their vessels scarred by months of running battles across the galaxy. The humans had been retreating for weeks, Vextu continued, his 6 eyes reflecting the swirling colors of the nebula. Admiral Kothrin had been pushing them back system by system, forcing them into this dead-end region of space. The shattered nebula was perfect. A natural trap with only one way in and no way out. His claws scraped against the podium as he gestured toward the display. Our fleet numbered 250 ships of the line, dreadnoughts the size of small cities, each one bristling with plasma cannons and quantum torpedoes. Cruisers that could crack a planet's crust, destroyers fast enough to chase down any fleeing vessel. The holographic ships rotated slowly, their weapon systems clearly visible as deadly protrusions along their hulls. Each Catherian vessel was a masterpiece of military engineering designed by a species that had been perfecting the art of war for over 1,000 years. The human fleet, Vextu's voice carried a note of something that might have been respect, numbered exactly 51 ships. Most of them were damaged, running on backup power, held together by emergency repairs made in the void between stars. Any military academy in the galaxy would have called it a massacre waiting to happen. The display shifted to show the human vessels, and even the most warlike delegates in the chamber felt a chill at what they saw. These weren't the pristine warships of a major power. They were the desperate remnants of a fleet that had been fighting for its life across half the galaxy. Their flagship was the UES Defiant, Vextu said, his mandibles clicking with remembered tension. A heavy cruiser that had been beautiful once, but now looked like it had been through an asteroid grinder. Hull plates were missing, exposing the framework beneath. One of its main engines was completely dead, the other sputtering with irregular pulses. The scarred warrior paused, his 6 eyes focusing on something beyond the chamber walls. The human fleet commander was Admiral Jin Ho, a man who had lost more battles than most species had ever fought. But he was still there, still fighting, still refusing to surrender, even when any rational being could see the odds. Admiral Kothrin opened communications one last time, Vextu continued. I was on the bridge of the command ship, watching as the human admiral appeared on our screens. His uniform was torn, his face streaked with soot from some internal fire. Behind him, I could see damage control teams working frantically to keep his ship functioning. The chamber fell silent as Vextu's voice took on the cadence of a formal military report. Our admiral offered the humans one final chance to surrender. "You are outnumbered 5-1, he said. "Your ships are dying around you. There is no shame in yielding to superior force." His 6 eyes blazed with remembered amazement. Dato looked directly into our cameras, and I will never forget what he said. "Admiral Cawthron, I appreciate the offer, but we didn't come this far to give up now. If you want our surrender, we'll have to come and take it." The holographic display erupted into motion as the battle began. Plasma beams lanced across space like spears of colored light, while quantum torpedoes streaked between the fleets like deadly comets. Human ships, impossibly outnumbered, spread out in a formation that made no tactical sense. "The first phase of the battle went exactly as predicted," Vextu said, his voice growing tense with remembered excitement. "Our superior numbers and firepower began tearing through their formation. I watched human ships explode in brilliant flashes of light, their crews dying in the vacuum of space." His mandibles clicked together nervously. Something that defied every principle of military logic I had ever learned. Instead of trying to escape or fighting to the bitter end, they started ... salvaging. The display zoomed in on a section of the battlefield where something unprecedented was happening. Human ships were moving among their own wreckage, not to rescue survivors, but to strip usable components from the dead hulls. Admiral Jinho had ordered his engineers to cannibalize their own destroyed vessels, Vextu said, his voice filled with disbelief even now. I watched through our long-range sensors as human work crews, wearing nothing but spacesuits and magnetic boots, crawled over the twisted wreckage of their own ships, cutting away hull plating, engines, weapon systems, anything that could still function. The scarred warrior's 6 eyes widened as he relived the impossible sight. They were welding armor from dead ships onto living ones, right in the middle of a battle, creating hybrid vessels that shouldn't have been able to hold together. Let alone fight one of their cruisers, the Soul's Pride. Had its entire forward section blown away by a quantum torpedo, Vextu continued. Any other species would have abandoned ship or scuttled the vessel. Instead, the human crew somehow grafted the bow section of another destroyed cruiser onto their ship, creating a Frankenstein's monster of metal and determination. The holographic display showed the incredible sight human ships that looked like they had been assembled from spare parts, their hulls a patchwork of different materials and designs. Steam and sparks flew from improvised connections as crews worked desperately to keep their impossible creations functioning. There was a human pilot named Heiwan, Vextu said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. She commanded a heavy cruiser called the Indomitable. When I first saw her ship through our tactical displays, I thought our sensors were malfunctioning. The display focused on a single vessel that barely deserved to be called a ship. Its hull was more repair foam than original metal, emergency welds creating a spider web of scars across its surface. One engine was completely missing, replaced by a smaller unit that had obviously been torn from a different class of vessel entirely. Her weapons were jury-rigged from 3 different ship types, Vextu continued, his mandibles clicking with what could only be described as admiration. Plasma cannons designed for destroyers, missile tubes salvaged from a transport, and what looked like a mining laser that had been modified into some kind of particle beam weapon. The scarred warrior leaned forward, his 6 eyes blazing with the memory. That ship should have broken apart the moment it tried to maneuver. The stresses of combat should have torn it to pieces. But somehow, through pure human stubbornness and engineering improvisation, it kept fighting. I watched Heiwan take her impossible ship directly into our battle line, Vextu said, his voice rising with excitement. She was firing with whatever. Weapons still worked, using her crippled vessel like a battering ram against ships 10 times her size. Every shot from our fleet should have vaporized her, but she kept weaving between our plasma beams like she was dancing. The holographic display showed the incredible sight: a ship that looked like flying scrap metal somehow outmaneuvering the most advanced warships in the Catherian fleet. Emergency lights flickered along its hull, an atmosphere vented from dozens of small holes, but it refused to die. When her ship finally began to break apart, Vexthu said, his voice growing quiet with something approaching reverence, "I thought we would finally see her eject." Her escape pod was still functional. Her crew could have abandoned ship and lived to fight another day. He paused, his 6 eyes reflecting the lights of the chamber. Instead, she did something that still haunts my dreams. She aimed her dying ship directly at our command dreadnought Admiral's flagship and punched her failing engines. To maximum power, the display showed the final moments of the Indomitable, its hull glowing red-hot as its overloaded engines pushed it toward the massive Catherian vessel. Explosions rippled along its length as systems failed one by one, but it kept accelerating. "Hey, one could have escaped," Vexu said, his voice cracking with emotion. Her pod bay was still intact. Her crew was begging her to abandon ship. Instead, she chose to turn her death into our defeat. The holographic display erupted in a brilliant flash of light as the human cruiser struck the Catherian dreadnought. The explosion tore through both ships, ripping apart armor plating and exposing the vital systems beneath. The blast took out half of our command structure, Vexlu concluded, his voice barely audible in the vast chamber. Admiral Cothran died in that explosion, along with most of his senior staff. The humans turned their defeat into our victory, sacrificing everything to strike a blow that would change the course of the war. His 6 eyes swept across the assembled delegates, taking in their shocked expressions. That's when I truly understood what we were fighting. Humans don't just fight wars, they become the war itself. They turn their losses into weapons, their defeats into victories, their deaths into legends that inspire others to keep fighting. The chamber fell silent, except for the soft hum of life support systems and the distant sound of the Zephyrian pods bubbling softly in their containment fields. Even the usually chattering hive collective had fallen completely quiet. In the end, Vexthu said, straightening to his full height, "We won that battle. But the humans won something more important. They won the right to call themselves warriors. Not because they were the strongest or the most numerous, but because they refused to accept defeat even when it was inevitable." The holographic display flickered and changed, showing the twisted wreckage of a Catherian assault pod drifting through the debris field that had once been the pride of 2 fleets. Emergency lights blinked weakly through cracked viewports, and atmosphere leaked in tiny crystalline streams that caught the light of distant stars. After the nebula battle, my command ship was destroyed. Vex's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. I was trapped in an escape pod for 6 hours, watching my life support systems fail one by one. The pod's hull had been punctured by micrometeorites, and my breathing apparatus was filling with the acrid smoke of burning electronics. His 6 eyes grew distant, focusing on something far beyond the council chamber. The poison was the worst. Part Catherian life support systems use a chemical mixture that becomes toxic when it oxidizes. My carapace had been cracked by shrapnel during the explosion, and every breath I took was slowly killing me. The assembled delegates leaned forward as the display zoomed in on the damaged pod. Through the cracked viewport, they could see the scarred warrior's younger self, his blue carapace split open like a broken shell, green fluid seeping from the wounds. I expected to die alone in that pod, Vexthu continued, his mandibles clicking with remembered pain. It's an honorable death for a Catherian warrior to fall in battle and drift among the stars. I had made peace with it, recited the death. Prayers of my ancestors prepared my spirit for the journey to the warrior's realm. He paused, his claws scraping against the podium. That's when I saw the human rescue ship approaching through the debris field. A small medical frigate, painted white with red crosses, the universal symbol for non-combatants. At first, I thought they were collecting their own wounded. The holographic display showed the sleek medical vessel weaving carefully between chunks of twisted metal and floating corpses. Its hull was unmarked by weapons. Its only defenses the ancient laws of war that supposedly protected medical personnel from attack. When their tractor beam locked onto my pod, I knew I was about to become a prisoner of war, Vexlus said, his voice growing stronger. I expected execution, torture, or at minimum, a prison cell on some remote human colony. Every species treats captured enemies according to their own nature. The Valdris interrogate them for intelligence. The Hive Collective simply assimilates them into the collective consciousness. His 6 eyes blazed with remembered confusion. But the humans did something that made no sense. Instead of taking me to a prison facility or interrogation center, they brought me directly to their medical bay. The display shifted to show the interior of the human medical ship: clean white walls, advanced surgical equipment, and beds designed for a dozen different alien physiologies. It looked more like a hospital than a military vessel. I was barely conscious when they pulled me. From the pod, Vexu continued. My carapace was split in 3 places. Poison was eating away at my internal organs, and my primary breathing apparatus had completely failed. Any rational military medic would have triaged me as unsalvageable and moved on to patients they could actually save. The scarred warrior's voice cracked slightly. But there was this human medic, a male named Wu Jin. Young for his species, maybe 25 cycles old, with the kind of intense focus that human doctors seem to possess naturally. He took one look at my dying body and immediately began working. The holographic display zoomed in on the medical bay, showing a human figure in surgical scrubs bending over the massive form of a wounded Catherian. Equipment beeped and hummed around them as vital signs fluctuated wildly on the monitors. He worked for 3 straight cycles, Vextu said, his voice filled with something approaching awe, barely stopping to eat, catching maybe an hour of sleep when exhaustion forced him to rest. I drifted in and out of consciousness, but I could always hear him talking to his assistants, consulting databases, trying procedure after procedure to keep me alive. The display showed the human medic hunched over a computer terminal, scrolling through vast databases of alien physiology. His eyes were red with fatigue, his hands shaking from too much stimulant medication, but he never stopped working. Problem was that humans had never treated a Catherian before. Vextu continued. Our species had been enemies from the moment we first made contact. Their medical databases contained basic anatomical information, but nothing about trauma surgery, nothing about how our organs respond to different medications. His mandibles clicked together in what might have been admiration. Swoojin did. Something that should have been impossible, he learned. In the middle of a medical emergency, while I was dying on his operating table, he taught himself Catherian medicine. The holographic display showed cross-sections of Catherian anatomy appearing. On screens around the medical bay, the human medic compared them to his patient, making notes and calculations as he worked to understand the alien physiology he was trying to save. He mixed human medical techniques with emergency field procedures he improvised on the spot, Vextha said, his voice growing stronger with remembered amazement. Using human surgical tools to repair organs they were never designed to work on. Adapting human medications to work with Catherian biochemistry. The scarred warrior leaned forward, his 6 eyes blazing with the memory. I regained consciousness during one of his procedures. The pain was incredible, like molten metal flowing through my veins. I saw this human standing over me, his hands inside my chest cavity, working to repair damage that should have been fatal. When I asked him why he was risking a court-martial for treating an enemy, Vextu's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. He looked at me with those strange human eyes so different from ours, so full of emotion, and said something that changed everything I thought I knew about war. The chamber fell completely silent, every delegate straining to hear the words that had shaken a veteran warrior to his core. He said, "Because you're hurt, and I swore an oath," Vexta repeated, his voice cracking with emotion.
Not because
It was strategically valuable to keep me alive, not because he hoped to extract information from me, simply because I was injured, and he had promised to heal anyone who needed his help. The holographic display showed the human medic's face, young and determined, as he continued his impossible work. There was no hatred in his expression, no fear or disgust at working on an alien enemy, only the focused compassion of a healer, doing what he believed was right. But Wu Jin wasn't the only one, Vextu continued, his mandibles spreading in what might have been a smile. There was a female human named Saw Young who worked in the medical bay's support staff, small 4. Her species, with kind eyes and gentle hands that seemed impossibly delicate compared to our claws. The display shifted to show a human female approaching the medical bed where the wounded Catharian lay recovering. She carried a tray of food and wore the simple uniform of a medical technician. Every day during my recovery, she brought me food, Vexlu said, his voice filled with wonder. Not the standard nutrient paste that military prisoners usually receive, but actual meals prepared according to Catharian dietary requirements. She had researched our cuisine, learned which foods we could digest, even discovered which flavors my species preferred. His 6 eyes grew brighter as he remembered. But the most incredible thing was that she spoke to me. In broken Catharian, our language, which she had somehow learned just to make me more comfortable during my recovery. The holographic display showed the human female sitting beside the medical bed, struggling with the complex clicking and chittering sounds of the Catharian language. Her pronunciation was terrible, her grammar completely wrong, but her effort was undeniable. She would sit with me for hours, Vexlu continued, his voice growing softer, asking about my homeworld, my family, my experiences before the war, not interrogating me for military intelligence, just talking, like I was a person instead of an enemy. The scarred warrior straightened to his full height, his 6 eyes sweeping across the assembled delegates. Do you understand the horror of this? In the middle of a war where my species and theirs were trying to exterminate each other, these humans treated me like family. The chamber erupted in a low murmur of confusion and disbelief. The very concept was alien to most of the assembled. Species showing kindness to an enemy was considered a sign of weakness, a tactical error that could be exploited. Soyoung would tell me about her home on Earth, Vexu said, his voice cutting through the murmur. A place called Seoul, where she had studied xenobiology before the war began. She showed me pictures on her personal datapad, images of a blue world with white clouds and green forests, so different from the rocky wastelands of my home planet. His mandibles clicked together nervously. She talked about her dreams of peaceful contact between species, of sharing knowledge and culture. Instead of exchanging plasma fire, even as the war raged around us, she believed that someday our peoples could be friends instead of enemies. The holographic display showed Earth hanging in space like a blue jewel, its surface unmarked by the scars of war. It was a vision of hope in a galaxy torn apart by conflict. That kindness terrified me more than any weapon they possessed. Vextu concluded, his voice barely audible in the vast chamber. Their plasma cannons could destroy my body. Their quantum torpedoes could reduce my ship to atoms. Their compassion could destroy everything I thought I knew about the nature of war itself. He paused, his 6 eyes reflecting the lights of the chamber. When you show mercy to an enemy, you force them to see you as more than just another target to be eliminated. You make them question not just their tactics, but their entire understanding of what it means to fight. The scarred warrior's voice grew stronger, filled with a conviction that seemed to resonate through the very walls of the chamber. That's the real weapon that humans possess, not their technology or their tactics, but their absolute refusal to let war turn them into monsters. They remain human even when everything around them demands they become something else. And that, Vextu said, his mandibles spreading in what was unmistakably a smile, is far more dangerous than any dreadnought or battle station they could ever build. The holographic displays around the chamber flickered and died, leaving only the natural lighting to illuminate the vast hall. Vexu straightened to his full height, his massive frame casting long shadows across the crystalline floor. Scarred warrior's 6 eyes swept across the assembled delegates, taking in their expressions of confusion, fear, and growing understanding. Honored council members, Vexu began, his voice carrying a weight that seemed to press down on every being. In the chamber, you summoned me here expecting tales of human monsters. Stories of brutality that would justify your fears. Evidence of war crimes that would validate your prejudices against this young species. He paused, his mandibles clicking together in what might have been bitter laughter. Instead, I give you something far more frightening, the truth about what humans really are. The Zephyrians and their water pods pressed against the transparent walls, their tentacles writhing with nervous energy. The insectoid hive collective representatives had fallen completely silent, their compound eyes glittering in the dim light. Even the ancient arbiters seemed to lean forward, sensing that something profound was about to be revealed. We Catharians are warriors born, Vexu continued, his voice taking on the rhythm of an ancient recitation. For 1,000 cycles, we have perfected the art of combat. Our children learned to fight before they learned to speak. War is in our blood, in our bones, in the very structure of our society. He gestured toward the Valdris delegation with one of his upper arms. The Valdris are tactical geniuses, capable of calculating battle outcomes across dozens of variables simultaneously. Their minds work like living computers, processing information and predicting enemy movements with mathematical precision. His gaze shifted to the empty section, where hegemony representatives would have sat if they attended such gatherings. The hegemony breeds perfect soldiers, mechanical beings designed for one purpose only. They know no fear, no doubt, no hesitation. Each unit is identical, replaceable, utterly focused on victory. The scarred warrior's 6 eyes blazed as he returned his attention to the center of the chamber. But humans are something else entirely. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the assembly like a heavy blanket. In the silence, the only sounds were the soft bubbling of the Zephorian pods and the distant hum of the station's life support systems. Humans remain human, even in war, Vexu said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. When every instinct should tell them to become killers, when every tactical manual says they should prioritize victory above all else, they do something that defies all military logic.
8.
The holographic displays flickered back to life, showing scenes from the war that had just ended. But these weren't images of battles or destroyed ships. They were moments of quiet humanity in the midst of cosmic horror. I watched a human named Dong Hyen during the siege of Proxima Station, Vexus continued, his voice growing stronger. He was a supply sergeant, responsible for distributing food rations to the human forces. By the 40th day of the siege, supplies were running critically low. The display showed a human figure in military uniform standing before a group of wounded aliens. His own face was gaunt with hunger, his uniform hanging loose on his diminished frame. Dongyan had enough rations left for maybe 10 human soldiers for one day, Vexthu said, his mandibles clicking with remembered amazement. Instead, he divided those rations among 30 wounded prisoners, Catharians, Valdris, even some captured. Hegemony units that had been damaged in battle. The chamber stirred with confusion. The very concept was alien to most of the assembled species. Giving your own food to enemies was tactical suicide, violation of every principle of warfare. When I asked him why he would starve his own people to feed his enemies, Vexthu continued. He looked at me with those strange human eyes and said, "They're not enemies right now. They're just hungry." The display shifted to show another scene. A human female in combat armor rushing through a burning cityscape. Plasma fire streaked overhead as buildings collapsed around her, their crystal structures shattering like broken glass. There was a female human called Dujin, Vextu said, his voice filled with something approaching reverence. A combat engineer, whose unit was tasked with destroying a communications array on Kepler 7. But when the bombing began, she discovered that the building housed civilian refugees from a species none of us had ever encountered before. The holographic display showed strange, ethereal beings with translucent skin and gossamer wings, refugees from a distant sector who had fled to Kepler 7, seeking safety from the expanding war. Any other soldier would have completed the mission, Vexu continued. The communications array was a legitimate military target, and civilian casualties are an accepted part of warfare. But the Jinn did something that made no tactical sense whatsoever. His 6 eyes blazed with the memory. She abandoned her mission, called in her entire unit, and spent 6 hours evacuating those civilians to safety. Before that moment, I've been farted with the one or at pine with and war away. And I wouldn't wait away with the one with the where and that ray way add up to render. I had some say cap was sitting over the web set. Closed in 6 hours while her own forces screamed at her through the cum system to complete the objective and withdraw. The display showed the incredible sight of human soldiers, carefully carrying the fragile alien refugees through the burning city, their weapons slung across their backs as they focused entirely on saving lives that weren't their responsibility. To save, the Jinn lost 3 soldiers during that evacuation, Vexasu said, his voice growing quiet. Good humans who died protecting strangers from a species they'd never met, couldn't even communicate with, had no reason to save, except that it was the right thing to do. The scarred warrior's mandibles spread in what could only be described as a smile, but the most incredible example was their commander, Admiral Sung-ho. After the Battle of the Binary Stars, when we had surrendered and laid down our weapons, tradition demanded that he execute our senior officers as an example. To others, the holographic display showed a human male in Admiral's uniform standing before a group of defeated Catherian warriors. His face was scarred by battle, his uniform torn and stained, but his eyes held no hatred or desire for revenge. Every military manual in the galaxy supported his right to summary execution, Vexu continued. We had killed thousands of his people, destroyed dozens of his ships, forced him to fight a war that should never have begun. Vengeance would have been easier, more satisfying, perfectly justified by the laws of war. He paused, his 6 eyes reflecting the lights of the chamber. Instead, Sung-ho chose mercy. He granted us full prisoner of war status, ensured we received medical treatment, even allowed us to send messages to our families to let them know we had survived. The chamber erupted in a low murmur of disbelief. Such mercy toward defeated enemies was virtually unheard of in galactic warfare. It was seen as weakness, a tactical error that could be exploited by future adversaries. When I asked him why he would show such kindness to enemies who had caused him so much pain, Vexthu said, his voice cutting through the murmur. He said something that still echoes in my mind cycles later. The scarred warrior's voice dropped, too barely above a whisper.
Ow.
Because the war is over, and we're all going to have to live with what we've done. Well, I'd rather live knowing I chose compassion over cruelty. Vexu straightened to his full height, massive frame dominating the center of the chamber. That is what makes humans the most terrifying force in the galaxy. Honored counsel, not their weapons, not their numbers, not their tactical innovations or technological advances. His 6 eyes blazed with an emotion the assembled delegates couldn't quite identify, part fear, part admiration, part something that might have been hope. We can learn their tactics, Vexu continued, his voice rising to fill every corner of the vast chamber. We can copy their weapons, reverse engineer their technology, study their battle formations, until we understand every detail of their military doctrine. He paused, letting his words sink in. We can even match their courage, their determination, their willingness to sacrifice everything for victory. But there is one thing we cannot learn, cannot copy, cannot replicate, no matter how hard we try. The chamber fell completely silent, every being focused entirely on the scarred warriors. Words. We cannot learn to be human, Vexthu said, his voice carrying a weight that seemed to press down on every soul in the chamber. We cannot learn to show compassion to those who would kill us, to sacrifice everything for strangers, to find hope where none should exist, to choose mercy when vengeance would be easier. His mandibles clicked together in what was unmistakably admiration. That is their true weapon, not their plasma cannons or quantum torpedoes, but their absolute refusal to become monsters, even when everything around them demands it. They fight wars without losing their souls, kill enemies without losing their humanity, win victories without becoming the very evil they oppose. The great hall fell silent as Vexthu stepped back from the podium, his testimony complete. Assembled delegates sat in stunned silence, processing the implications of what they had heard. They didn't defeat us with superior firepower or brilliant tactics, Vexthu concluded, his voice barely audible in the vast chamber. They defeated us by remaining human when we became something less. They showed us what we had lost in our pursuit of military perfection, our ability to see enemies as people, to find common ground even in the midst of conflict. The Catharian warrior bowed his massive head, a gesture of respect that sent ripples of shock through the assembled delegates. And that, honored council, is why we will never truly understand how to fight them. Because to defeat humans, you would have to become more human than they are. And that, I believe, is impossible. His 6 eyes swept across the chamber one final time, taking in the faces of beings from dozens of worlds, each one grappling with the profound implications of his testimony. The humans taught me that the greatest victory is not conquering your enemy, Vexthu said, his voice growing stronger. With conviction, it's conquering the war itself, staying true to who you are when everything tells you to become something else. They won not because they were better killers, but because they refused to let killing define them. The scarred warrior straightened to his full height, his voice carrying to every corner of the vast chamber. That is my testimony, honored council. That is the truth about the humans and why they terrify us all. It's not because they are monsters, but because they refuse to become monsters even when we do. They are the mirror that shows us what we have lost, the light that reveals how far we have fallen into darkness. And perhaps his voice dropped to a whisper, filled with something that might have been hope. They are also the path back to what we once were, before war consumed our souls. Vextu stepped back from the podium and bowed deeply to the assembled council, his massive frame casting one final shadow across the chamber floor. The humans saved my life when they had every reason to let me die. They showed me kindness when I deserved only hatred. They treated me as family when I was their enemy. That is the most terrifying weapon in the galaxy, the power to transform enemies into allies through nothing more than compassion. The chamber remained silent for long moments after Vexu finished speaking, the weight of his words settling over the assembled delegates like a heavy shroud. Finally, High Arbiter Lindar spoke, her ancient voice trembling with emotion. Council will deliberate on this testimony, but I think I speak for all present when I say that you have given us much to consider about the nature of warfare, mercy, and what it truly means to be civilized beings in an uncivilized galaxy. As the session ended and delegates began filing out of the chamber, many of them cast long, thoughtful looks back at the scarred Catharian warrior, who had forced them to confront uncomfortable truths about themselves and their species. The humans, it seemed, had won far more than just a war. They had won something much more valuable and infinitely more dangerous. The power to change hearts and minds, across the galaxy. The end.